What's up? So today I want to talk about this lens, the Vilrox 13mm f1.4. This is the Fuji version, but there's also a version for Sony APS-C cameras. And this is the lens that I've been waiting for, well, basically since I first got into the Fuji XF system. I actually bought this pretty much the second it was available to purchase here in Germany. And obviously I bought it with my own money and I paid full price for it. And since I got it, I actually have used it a ton, both for personal vlogs and photography, but mainly as my new sort of main lens for this YouTube channel. The reason why I was so excited to get this lens is that I thought that it might be the best option to fight the two biggest drawbacks you get with APS-C cameras: low light performance and background separation. This will, however, not be an in-depth review. I don't really have the knowledge or the patience to make something like that. I will, however, give you my honest opinion of my real-life experience of using this lens, as well as a ton of sample footage and images. So if you're interested in this lens, you might want to stick around. Before we get into how this lens actually performs, let's just quickly talk about the build quality, the size and the weight of the thing, because this lens is a tank. Just in terms of how solid it feels, it is easily on par with Fuji's lens offerings in my opinion. This lens feels so weighty and everything about it feels firm and high quality. At the same time though, that is obviously also a bit of a disadvantage, since this is noticeably big and heavy, especially for an APS-C lens. At roughly 420 grams, this guy is definitely not light. And with its size, it looks big, even on my X-T4. And on my X-T30, it looks downright ridiculous. If you want a setup that is as small and lightweight as possible, this is not for you. I honestly don't have much of a problem with that though. Would it be better if it was half its size and weight while maintaining its quality? Well, yes, sure. But I guess you can't have it all. Maybe they could even shrink it down a bit, but I guess at the very least they would have to up the price tag to do that. And me personally, I'm just fine with the way it is. I don't think it is too big or too heavy, and I also think that it comes in at a very fair price point, especially when you compare it to how Fuji prices their lenses. Also, just as a side note, if you are schlepping around a big camera like the Fuji X-T4, small and lightweight is sort of out of the window anyway. To be completely real with you though, the fact that a setup with the Fuji X-T4 and any prime lens you could choose is as big as it is however still something of a turn off for me when it comes to using it for vlogging. I just don't find it comfortable to whip something like this out and hold it out in front of me, especially in a public space. So on most occasions I would probably prefer to use something like my beloved Sony ZV-1 for vlogging, because that camera still offers very impressive image quality, but with a lot more flexibility in a body that can actually be considered compact. With that being said, if image quality is all that you're after, this lens really does not pull any punches. And it absolutely unchains your APS-C camera in all the areas where these cameras usually really lag behind their full frame counterparts, especially low light performance and background separation with a wide field of view. So let's talk about how this performed for shooting video in a bit more detail. Okay, so this is probably the part you're most interested in. In order to keep a bit of a structure though, I will split this up in 4 subcategories. First, autofocus speed and reliability. Second, stabilization. Third, background separation. And fourth, low light performance and overall image quality and look. And without any further ado, let's get right into the first point. If you want to get a feeling of how the autofocus performs in a reasonably well controlled situation, you can pretty much just basically watch any of my videos over the past few months, because all of the talking head shots right in this place, with the exception of this video of course, have been shot on the Vilrox 13mm. So if this is what you're going for, I would recommend it without any hesitation. However, I have also used it outside, as you do, and it has been mostly positive, but with a few rather bad exceptions. Most of the time, the autofocus is reliable enough for me with this lens. In my experience, with face detect activated, it latches onto me quite well and rarely ever loses me. It's also quick enough to go from something in the foreground to something in the background and vice versa. Pretty much the only time I really had any issues was in the snow. For some reason, the camera or lens had a really hard time focusing on anything and it was constantly hunting for a subject. Now granted, those are truly difficult situations for any camera and lens combo, so I'm tempted to give it a break on this one. Also, to be completely honest, my guess would be that this is more of a fault of the Fuji and not as much of the Vilrox. But who knows, I could be wrong about that. I have however learned my lesson, and since this lens and camera combo has a tendency to hunt for a subject when I go for a wide open shot, I tend to just leave it in single AF and be done with it. Problem solved. So overall I'd say that the AF is really not an issue for me. I found it to be reliable enough and it works pretty well with my Fuji cameras. What has been a far bigger issue though is getting somewhat stable handheld footage with this lens. Now this might be a bit much to ask, and really this is an unstabilized lens, so it is really not the lens's fault if any other stabilization system that I use sucks. But still, for me as a user, what really counts is if I can use this lens with a system of my choice for run and gun types of situations. And primarily for me that means getting smooth handheld footage. So can you? Well, somewhat, yeah, but it's kind of difficult. Let me explain. As I said before, I have used this lens mostly with my Fuji X-T4, which has in-body image stabilization, and I've also used it with my Fuji X-T30, which doesn't. If I hold the Fuji X-T4 completely still and focus all of my energy on being a human tripod, I might get acceptably stable footage. If however I want to do something like a panning shot, you can immediately notice it starting to wobble in the corners. You can use the digital stabe on the X-T4, which helps, but it also crops into your image, and that kind of defeats the purpose of having such a wide angle lens. For vlogging it works for like half of the time, but the other half of the time it's actually quite bad. When it actually works, the image looks glorious, but the corner wobbles that you get if the image stabilization fails are annoying enough for me to not use this lens for vlogging, at least with the Fuji X-T4. Because when I used it with the non-stabilized X-T30, it was actually kind of alright. Yes, there are shakes and they are noticeable and slightly annoying when you are standing still, but when you're moving, they just look sort of natural. And honestly, I don't have any issues with that when it comes to vlogging. What this means in conclusion is that, in my opinion, if you want to use this lens for vlogging handheld, you might want to consider turning off IBIS if your camera has it. If vlogging, however, is not your primary concern, but you're really just going for epic handheld B-roll, this is usable for that if you concentrate hard enough, but honestly it's probably not your best choice. If I had to choose between this Vilrox 13mm and the Fuji 16mm f1.4 as a lens to use for shooting handheld B-roll, I would go with the Fuji 16mm any day of the week, without hesitation. But what does actually seem to work, even with the Vilrox, is getting those following shots even with IBIS activated. No idea why. So again, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of stabilization, and it's also not really the fault of the Vilrox lens. I would absolutely love to know if this is less of an issue with the new Fuji X-H2, which is supposed to have a far superior IBIS system, but since I don't have one, I can only speculate on that. In terms of the low light performance, the lens itself really does, of course, not affect the overall noise performance of the camera body that you're using. But what it does is give you the ability to stay in lower ISO ranges for longer, which is great on an APS-C system, since high ISO performance has always been the Achilles heel of any APS-C camera. With that out of the way though, let's quickly talk about the amount of background separation, or bokeh, that you can get with this lens. It's good for a wide angle lens on an APS-C camera, and certainly worlds better compared to what you would get at 13mm on something like the Fuji 10-24mm f4. It's in a class of its own, and it is just what I asked for. At the same time, we have to be real here. As much as we like to work with conversions and equivalency, this is not a true 20mm lens. This is a 13mm lens. And at least in my opinion, the whole thing of converting aperture numbers to the full frame equivalence really kind of falls apart at the wider ends of the lens spectrum. In practice, that means that yes, you can get a good amount of background separation up until a point, but from that point onwards, your beloved bokeh vanishes into nothing with every inch that your subject moves further away from your camera. That is just what it is though. But still, if all you want to do is operate this at arm's length, or maybe a bit more, I think you would be more than happy with the type of background separation you can get with this lens. I certainly am, which again is the reason why this is now my primary lens for these talking heads types of shots. Lastly, I quickly want to gloss over the image quality of this lens. I'll keep it quick since I have no data to back up any of my claims. I found the image quality to be sharp and very pleasing overall, and I didn't notice any severe distortions or chromatic aberration. Since I currently enjoy that slightly dreamy soft look, I almost always use this lens with a 67mm Tiffen Black Pro Mist 1/8 stop filter. Overall, I really do enjoy the video files that I get out of this lens with my Fuji cameras. And that wraps up the video section. So let's quickly continue with the photography side of things. I will keep this section short because I really don't feel qualified to speak on this topic at length. And I also honestly haven't used the Vilrox all that much for photography. But when I do, it's most likely for some type of POV photography, especially indoors or in confined spaces, because it gives me that wider field of view, but still also a bit of depth. And I think it works wonderful for those areas. The amount of depth you get at f1.4 makes your images feel more three-dimensional, and with its wide-ish field of view, you can get a good representation of what's going on right in front of you, even in fairly confined spaces. The large aperture is also a godsend, and in tandem with Fuji's IBIS, it makes life so easy in low light situations, it's ridiculous. There are also no real drawbacks in my opinion. If I had to name one though, I would say that this 20mm full frame equivalent field of view is still not all that wide. There's certainly a big enough difference between this and the Fuji 16mm, which is a 24mm full frame equivalent, so it's not hard to justify this lens's existence, but at the same time, obviously, this cannot give me the same type of field of view that I can get with the Fuji 10 to 24mm at 10mm. But hey, again, you can't have it all, and if you have to go for a compromise lens, I think 30mm is just right. So once again, no real criticism here. In conclusion, this is a fantastic lens, and Fuji should be so grateful to Vilrox because, in my opinion, this makes the whole Fuji ecosystem so much more interesting, because finally now there is an option for a good wide-angle prime with a 1.4 aperture. Wide-angle lenses with a wide aperture were always something that was lacking for all kinds of APS-C systems. But now we are finally starting to see some good options pop up on the market, which I absolutely love. And as far as I know, this is probably the best one that you can get. The only elephant in the room here really is the size and the weight of the thing. It's pretty much as big as Sony's 20mm f1.8 that they have for their full frame lineup. So that means that using this lens on my Fuji X-T4 is probably a system of the same size as using that Sony 20mm f1.8 mounted to something like a Sony a7 IV. And you can obviously make the argument that if you lose the benefit of the smaller size with your APS-C camera, why not go for the full frame system then? Well, there is obviously some truth to that argument, but at the same time you have to keep in mind that this lens is in the 400 to 500 euro range, and the Fuji X-T4 is in the, I don't know, 1400 euro range. So at worst, this whole setup would cost you around 1900 bucks. Now compare that to what the Sony full frame equivalent of this setup would cost, and you would easily end up in the 3 to 3.5 grand range. And that really makes a huge difference, especially when you keep in mind that the image quality that you can get out of a setup like this is probably sufficient for at least 95% of the people out there. Also, I am seriously still in love with Fuji's colors, and especially with their F-Log files on the X-T4. You might disagree, but I think these shots look fantastic, and I would have a hard time giving that up to go to another system. Also, at least now with this new lens, I honestly don't even feel like I'm missing out on that much by not going for a full frame setup. But hey, I might be wrong about this, and maybe I'll change my mind completely at some point. Who knows? But at least for now, I am very happy with this setup. But anyway, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about this lens or anything else, leave them down in the comments below. Until next week, take care. Bye bye.